Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second presentation of the year. I am, as always, Brent Taylor, the convener of the Speaker Program for Military and History and Heritage Victoria. And on behalf of our committee, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. The speaker tonight is Michael Piggott, speaking about New Fella Master, Beyond the Trenches, Australia's Neglected World War I Story. A little bit about Michael. Michael is a retired archivist living in Canberra. His career began at the National Library in early 1970s, included subsequent roles at the Australian War Memorial and National Archives of Australia, and ended at the University of Melbourne in 2009 as University Archivist and Manager, Cultural Collections Group. He has remained semi-active professionally within the Australian Society of Archivists and writing occasional reviews for the website, in brackets, Honest History. He was awarded an AM on the 2017 Queen's Birthday Honours for significant service to the community as an archivist and with national and international education and cultural institution, and as an author. A detailed CV is available on the academic website or ORCID. Now, a little bit of process before Michael begins. Most of you will have heard this before, but bear with me. Michael will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask your questions in one of two ways. You can post a chat anytime up to and including question time and address the question to everybody. When it comes time, I'll read your question using whatever name appears on your computer identity. Or you can wait and put your hand up during question time, and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. Michael is happy for cameras to be on, but remember that everyone can also see you. Please make sure your microphones are switched off. By now you should be in speaker view, and I invite Michael to speak. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Brent. I really hope everyone can hear me. I want to thank Brent and Jason. They've been extremely helpful getting this underway. Perhaps you'll relate to this comment. I'm very much from the typewriter generation and am still getting used to Zooming. One final preliminary, I want to acknowledge one of your patrons who I got to know when I was at the memorial, Dr. Peter Edwards, who had his challenges trying to coordinate a massive multi-volume official history, not only of the Vietnam War, but related conflicts. And a final preliminary, I realised going through this talk earlier today, I used the memorial as shorthand. When I say memorial, just privately note I'm talking about the Australian War Memorial. Right. I'm sure the people watching tonight and the membership of this society generally lead a little reminder that the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, the ANMEF, lead little reminder of it, nor that there was fighting in German New Guinea briefly when German New Guinea was captured. But in brief, there was fighting and shelling on the 11th and 12th of September 1914, and a long occupation which ended on the 9th of May 1921. In total, about 3,000 personnel were involved, 1,500 in the initial capture and garrisoning, and another 1,500 as successive replacements were sent during the occupation. By any measure, the official casualty numbers were low. 6 Australians killed or died of wounds, 4 wounded. 1 German killed and 1 wounded. And an estimated, a very rubbery estimate, 30 of the Germans' native police killed and 11 wounded. Some of those captured, the Germans I mean, were interned back in Australia. Others were allowed to stay, having sworn oaths of neutrality. At the peace conference, Billy Hughes leveraged disproportionate war losses to gain control of the German colonies south of the equator. The resultant League of Nations C-class mandate, meaning Australian immigration policy, applied. For a couple of decades, Australia had a buffer against Japan, or thought it had. There were also economic gains, expropriated properties, employment for ex-servicemen, and Nauruan high-grade phosphate. The ANMEF is practically unknown to the public, however, although there have been plenty of reminders of the capture and occupation in the past 20 years. Since 2005, 4 or 5 books and websites on the capture have appeared. Easily the best, Robert Stevenson's 2021 History, Australia's First Campaign. There have also been a new biography of the first administrator, Colonel William Holmes. In 2014, there were further reminders at the beginning of the centenary of the First World War, including a new 50-cent coin. And in 2017, another reminder of the discovery of the wreck of the submarine AE1. Yet there remains minimal interest, particularly in the occupation, and minimal interest in how what happened has been represented by participants, by the War Memorial, by veterans seeking honours, awards and reward, and by historians, official, academic, and popular. And zero interest in the New Guineans, always in the background. Even during the 50th anniversary celebrations last year of PNG independence, memory stretched back only to the Second World War and the so-called Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. My aim in New Fellow Master was firstly to look at the men, backgrounds, motives, attitudes, and behaviour, and to do this using contemporary diaries and letters. Not a big surprise there, following the approach popularised by Patsy Adam Smith, Bill Gamage, among others. But after 110 years, ironically or surprisingly, that had not been done before. My aim was also to invent John Keegan's question in that old classic, The Face of Battle, to ask not what was it like to be in battle, but rather what was it like not to be in one. In other words, to look at how the men, and others including nurses, coped as military personnel with very little military to do, deeply frustrated while reading about the fighting in Europe. I also wanted to look at how they coped with the very trying tropical conditions, how they coped with boredom, and how they coped with the task of administering a colony. The book's contents page shows the way the chapters were structured. I really hope you can see that. A structure in 3 parts. My approach was, firstly, to offer an in-depth study of an infamous case involving the flogging by a group of drunken Germans of the missionary Reverend William Cox and the calculated reprisal punishment in kind and extrajudicially authorised by Colonel Holmes. Secondly, to look at some themes, including looting and attitudes to race. And thirdly, to consider the challenge of compiling accurate casualty numbers for all involved, arising from the fighting and the occupation. In a couple of cases, a challenge the War Memorial Roll of Honour failed. I also looked at 8 individuals, officers, individual soldiers, an historian, SS Mackenzie, a mother, a nurse, and a sergeant in the New Guinea Police, each cast as a question, as you can see there. So it's not a traditional battle history. How could it be, given so little fighting and 6.5 years occupation? When did you last read a history of an occupation? Can you name an occupation as part of Australian military history apart from Beecroft? There is absolutely nothing to interest a local equivalent of Ken Burns in this topic, let alone a Peter Fitzsimons. So what I plan to do now, if you'll indulge me, is to share 3 of those stories from that list of 8. The first concerns Private Harry Malthouse, who enlisted for service in New Guinea in 1917 and ended up a POW in Germany, where he died in late 1918. New Guinea, Germany. It's quite odd. Go figure. His story allows me to highlight one of the oddest sidelights in Australia's First World War experience. More on that in a minute. Although, hands down, the most unlikely and little-known sidelight was the ANMEF and Navy participation in the British-French punitive expedition in late 1916 on Malakula Island, New Hebrides. So, first question, why did Harry Malthouse enlist? On the 13th of July 1917, William Henry Malthouse, known as Harry, married with children and living in Burwood, Sydney, enlisted for service abroad, specifically to reinforce the ANMEF. His enlistment papers recorded him as age 46, born in South Norwood, London, and having previously served with the Royal Navy and the Royal Navy Reserve. He worked at the Botanic Gardens as a mechanic, gardener, and greenkeeper. After a fortnight's training for garrison duties at the showground, he sailed for a ball with 5 officers and a dozen other ranks. Most were returning from furlough and included men holding senior medical and administrative positions. Their transport, shown here, the Burns Phelps steamer SS Matunga, was laden with coal and other supplies for the Rabaul garrison and inter-island shipping. Elsewhere, the German raider SMS Wolf had been operating in the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, off the coast of Australia and New Zealand since leaving the port of Kiel the previous November. An auxiliary cruiser disguised as a freighter was armed with torpedoes, mines, concealed guns, and a seaplane. It also had specially designed coal storage to give it a long operating range. But its reserves were low when it intercepted an all-clear radio message from the Matunga to Rabaul reporting its impending arrival. The raider captured the Matunga 10 days out of Sydney and on the 6th of August 1917 escorted it to Waigeo Island off West New Guinea, transferred its cargo crew and passengers, and sank it. When the Matunga's soldiers and crew were disembarked at Kiel in March 1918, medical officers were transferred to neutral Denmark, thence to Britain, and others sent to an officers' camp, Heidelberg. Other ranks were dispersed to POW camps at Brandenburg, Karlsruhe, and Pachim, and several, including Malthouse, remember Malthouse? To Gustrau in northeast Germany. Having endured 5 months on the Wolf, confined below deck, many, including Malthouse, were again tested in Germany, not least by the cold. From evidence gathered by the Australian Red Cross Society Wounded and Missing Inquiry Bureau, we know that Malthouse's health declined, though when a younger man, was an active cyclist and physically very fit. First, it was believed he had gastritis, then arteriosclerosis. Red Cross food parcels and letters from his wife made little difference, nor the transfer to light duties. His captors did not think his condition justified a transfer or exchange, or when the armistice was announced, early preference for repatriation. For a while, reading the Bible seemed to help, though eating became painful. He lost weight and his hair turned white. He died on the 6th of December, 1918. He was buried 3 days later with full military honours in the presence of 130 Australian POWs in the camp cemetery. Old Harry, as he'd become known, had been highly popular, and other prisoners later paid to have a headstone made for his grave. For Malthouse's wife Dorothea, there had been 6 months of worried silence and official advice of his capture and probable safety, followed by a matching period of actual news, letters, and with the armistice, hope. Standard reminders of loss followed. In 1919, a pension for her and a son, and a probate notice. In 1921, a memorial scroll and a king's message. In 1923, a memorial plaque. A year later, she was informed that his remains had been reinterred, quote, with every measure of care and reverence, in a war cemetery near Hamburg, operated by the Imperial War Graves Commission. The vast First World War literature has barely noticed the Wolf's remarkable exploits, just as Australia's has largely overlooked the capture of the Matunga, entirely preventable had it obeyed warnings about radio security. If this was one of the most unlikely sideshows of the German New Guinea occupation, Private Malthouse's role was smaller still. And now interest is limited to family and local historians through his rediscovered associations from the 1890s with the Jenolan Caves, where Malthouse used to ride his bike from Sydney too. Yet across the years, an age-old question endures. Why did he enlist in the first place? And why in mid-1917, by which time enlistees certainly knew, but ignored the risks? Hence the so-called mystery of second acceptance. If ever knowable, answers beyond generalities are now elusive, as scholars like Joan Beaumont and Bill Gamage, writing about motives, have warned. For the latter, there were 1,000 particular and personal reasons, triggers and retrospective justifications. Having cited about a dozen examples, some obvious, loneliness, family trouble, public opinion, unemployment, and some obscure, sacked after punching the boss, Gamage concluded the list was almost infinite. If Malthouse shared his thinking aloud, his words are long gone. Yarns, as the great historian Greg Denning said, are lost on the breath of the voice. Perhaps his English ancestry and previous imperial service predisposed Malthouse to supporting the war effort. But it is his age that gives the strongest cause for wonder. On enlistment, he was recorded as 46, technically beyond the official range, even when conditions were relaxed for general recruitment in mid-1915, extending to 45, if still within the rule for Tropical Force, the first large enlistment in 1915 to Rabaul, and other reinforcements allowing men up to 50 for New Guinea. But Malthouse was 51. Some sources put it higher. A son, 26-year-old Charles, had already joined the AIF, so might easily So Malthouse might easily have rationalised the family had contributed enough. And as the Malthouses had already lost 4 children, barely months old, they had suffered enough sadness to risk more. Unhappiness at the Botanic Gardens, where he had been since 1898, does not seem to have been a push factor. One senses from the Sydney Morning Herald report of his farewell that he was liked and well regarded, a farewell at which the Botanic Gardens director presented him with a wristlet watch and a money belt. Perhaps it was the obvious patriotism and persuasive recruiters, certainly more likely than anticipated adventure given his age. The need for enlistments was constantly before the public mind, as was the memory of the first bitterly contested conscription referendum, and another later that year was already in planning once the first had been lost. Finally, does Jane Beaumont's question, why did individual Australians think, what did they think, the men who were to volunteer and the women who were to send them, hint at something often overlooked? Malthouse's frame of mind and his wife Dorothea's are beyond reach. Now we can do no more than list likely conditioning factors and wonder. We have the enlistment papers and we can read what was attested. But as lawyer and historian Kate Oughty wrote investigating a blind alley in another mystery, which also involved soldiers, sometimes the truth will never be known. As she put it, the document exists, the file was created, but the discussion around the table is not recorded. Bear with me. There's a second question, and we're shifting focus. Why did Eva Moffat drown? The question reminds us that the fighting on the 11th of September essentially involved naval reservists, and that grief and loss are often worse when there is no grave. One of the Australians who died of wounds during the capture of the German Wallis Station on the 11th of September 1914 was 20-year-old able seaman Robert Moffat, a naval reservist signaller who had volunteered to join the expedition. He was born in 1894 in Lostwithiel, Cornwall, then in 1901 migrated with his parents to Sydney. His father died 2 years later, by which time Robert was at Superior Public School, Waverley, and in the Naval Cadets. As a teenager, he worked as an apprentice at an engineering works and moved from the cadets to the Royal Australian Naval Reserve. Much about Moffat's wounding remains unclear, and historians differ about the details. Was the sniper a German or a New Guinean? The number of wounds, and why the hospital ship SS Krantala, which would have provided him better care, arrived days late. Rear Admiral, later Vice Admiral Patey's official account covered the death in 2 sentences. It began by noting Moffat had been severely wounded by gunshot wound fracturing spine, and ended, he was buried from HMAS Australia at sea with naval honours. To this summary, several letters and heart-wrenching detail about the wounded Moffat's cries while in intense pain and asking for his mother. Press items offered further detail and referred to an extremely popular, larger-than-life figure, affectionately known for obvious reasons as Little Bob. He was only 4'9". The most revealing piece was by an ex-Naval Reserves officer, clearly influential as a father figure, who wrote that the teenager never tired of listening to my tales of the sea, and it was his joy to borrow an old uniform cap that I kept hanging on the wall. When Bob got that hat on, he was made. He often consulted me about joining the Royal Navy, but I always reminded him of his family obligations, and so, I suppose, he did the next best thing and joined the reserve. On volunteering, Moffat was quoted as saying, "I can't shirk my duty. I am not a coward." Despite his mother's protests, Eva Moffat was 58, widowed, and had borne 10 children, and already lost 2 while very young. Then the telegram arrived. Historian Jay Winter asked how war widows mourned and what became of them, concluding that most cases remain a mystery. We do know the news devastated Eva. Moffat had lived at home, had been his mother's right hand. 2 daughters also at home would have been some comfort. But then her only other living son, 24-year-old Josiah, enlisted in the AIF in September 1915 as a gunner in a field artillery brigade. With worry came sleeplessness. By now, Eva was a night walker, wandering the inner city Sydney streets, growing increasingly unwell. In April 1918, she was found with a gashed wrist, spent a week in hospital, and was discovered in a nearby, and was released to live with one of her daughters. Shortly after, she was discovered in a nearby disused quarry. The death certificate referred to asphyxia from drowning and added that she had been temporarily of unsound mind. How the Moffat family responded is largely ignored in the extant record, despite the prevailing stigma attached to suicide. We want to believe somehow the children coped, somehow got on with their lives. Or like daughter Dorothy, who married later in 1918, somehow started new ones. A postscript of sorts can be gleaned from an April 1919 letter in Josiah's AIF personnel file from his oldest sister Alice. She asked base records, when was he likely to return to Australia, explaining she was the eldest of the family now, that his mother and mine died some months ago, and they were anxious for news of him. Josiah returned thankfully in July and was discharged in October. A century later, the extended Moffat family briefly revived Robert's and Eva's names, enabled partly by the fortuitous agency of his great-great-nephew, Nick Grimm's media contacts. Is with the ABC, Nick Grimm, and maybe a name known to you. As well as recalling their memory and suffering, the family sought to highlight the absence of any memorial in Australia to the 6 who had died in September 1914. 5 have grave sites, of course, at Bitapaka, 50 miles south of Rabaul, tended by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The absent 6th inevitably conjuring the emptiness Robert's mother endured between the news of his death and burial at sea and her death in April 1918. Eva Moffat had no photo of her son's grave. There was no grave. She had lost her husband in 1903 and was separated from her extended family and Cornish heritage. She learned from letters how Robert had suffered in death. Her news predated by 8 months Australian casualties in Europe, and by extension the so-called fictive kinship of fellow mourners. By the time public rituals and organisations were as historian Bruce Gates put it, rewriting private pain as patriotic pride and noble Christian sacrifice. Another Moffat son, and by that time, another Moffat son was already leaving Australia in uniform. The only formal offered sympathies were the brief words of a telegram delivered by a rector new to the role and out of his depth. Her son's death was not eulogised like Lieutenant Commander Elwell's and Captain Brian Pockley's. There was no well-connected father like Dr. Frank Pockley to lobby the powerful about proper acknowledgement of a son. Next of kin plaques and scrolls intended as a solace for bereavement and as a memento, only began to be issued a year after a death. Even if there were surviving personal sources, it is a conceit to think we can imagine Eva Moffat's ultimately unbearable grief during those 43 months. But we do have the insights of historian Tanya Lockins, drawn from the patient records of women committed to Victoria's Hospital for the Insane during the war. Her composite profile is of emotional, physical, and mental breakdown triggered by loss. One of women incessantly and aimlessly walking around, of mothers feeling intensely isolated in the family home, no longer their settled domain. Any number of Lookins' examples evoke fellow historian Joy de Mussie's sacrificial mothers, and certainly Eva. One of the confined mothers, Lukins wrote of her, that she was a housewife of sober, careful, industrious habits, who, without any relatives in Australia, was raising a young daughter while enduring months of anxious waiting. Social isolation, lack of emotional intimacy, and menopause were a potent mixture. She was unable to form a network of human relationships to lean on. So often the cruelties of war continue in peacetime and leave one lost as to how to respond. Even so, we might puzzle over the unsettling link between Moffat's burial at sea and Eva's middle name, Ophelia, recalling a Shakespearean fictional suicide by drowning. There was, of course, one final sad trick of fate. Eva did not live to receive the comfort of a ceremony at Rushcutters Bay Naval Depot in February 1921, when 1914-15 Imperial Stars were presented to Rabaul Naval Reserve veterans, and at which, to quote a press report, a few posthumous presentations were made to wives and mothers. I have one more personal focus, and one more question, and apologising ahead of it, I get on the high horse slightly. See what you think. This final question carries a plea that we remember the loyalty of the ANMEF Native Police. The Royal PNG Constabulary traces its beginnings to this Australian force, yet no one in Australia seems to have heard of them. The question: should Police Sergeant Kiup have received a medal? In a May 1919 report to the Secretary, Department of Defence, Melbourne, the Administrator, Brigadier General George Johnson, described an act of exceptional loyalty and physical stamina. The story began on the mid-north coast of mainland New Guinea, near the Dutch border at Wainemo. Originally an outpost of the commercial operations of the New Guinea Company. Here, as part of Johnson's expansionist approach, a small military presence had been established subordinate to the larger garrison 129 kilometres east at Itapi under District Officer Captain James Oliphant. The geography is relevant. Among the tiny garrison's strength was Private Lionel Stafford, the 27-year-old draper seconded for duty as a medical orderly. In April 1919, he developed malignant malaria and phthisis, that is tuberculosis, becoming so sick that his life was in danger. A radio message warned his parents he was seriously ill. Accordingly, a runner from among the New Guinea police, Sergeant Piggott, was sent to Itapi for emergency medication. Travelling practically non-stop day and night, there's a bit of a Cliff Young effort here, he completed the return journey, which normally took 8 days, in half the time. Once well enough to be transported to Rabaul, Stafford spent several months in hospital, was promoted to sergeant, I like that, then sent back to Australia. Based on details provided by Oliphant, Administrator Johnson described to the Defence Department the physical obstacles and dangers Piggott had faced. Even if the sergeant had known some of the terrain, there is no doubt that as a stranger travelling through other communities' territory, he would have been at serious risk of being killed. Johnson went on to point the moral. The case, he said, reported, shows the wonderful powers of endurance possessed by a well-trained and well-fed native, sufficiently disciplined to be obedient and anxious to do the best for his officers. Johnson also mentioned Piggott's action in administrative orders and directed he receive an honorarium of £1, the equivalent of 2 months' pay. The acting Minister for Defence was so taken with the story that he released it to the press, as you can see. Stafford's war was over. He had been with the ANMEF less than a year, and by August 1919, back in Melbourne. He was treated at a military hospital and later sanitarium, his health monitored, and records made of night sweats, sputum, weight, x-rays, lung function, appetite, and further malaria attacks. In March 1920, he was discharged as permanently unfit. But the threat to his life had passed. Ironically, it was his district officer, Captain Oliphant, who 2 months after Stafford's emergency died of exhaustion following intestinal obstruction at Cairns, diverted there travelling home on health grounds from Itapi. Stafford fully recovered from malaria and tuberculosis before he died aged 75 in December 1966. He received a Returned Soldier's Badge and a British War Medal. And Sergeant Piggott, I hear you ask, did he feel proud or shortchanged? If his recovery was measured, weighed, and recorded, the details are missing from the files. What happened to him after he saved Stafford's life? Certainly, no canonisation of Simpson and his donkey or Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels proportions. In the Australian Annals of Capture and Occupation, New Guineans are presented as collectives, wrongdoers subject to corporal punishment, imprisonment, punitive expeditions and execution, or as contract labourers on plantations, carriers on patrols, villagers subject to head tax, missionaries' assistants, and in the beginning, the enemy's auxiliaries. And then, well, our police too. In his report of a punitive expedition, Captain Horace Fuchs, the district officer at Lorengau on Manus Island, that's when our connection with Manus began. You keep hearing about Manus, Nauru and detention centres. That's when our relationship started. The district officer at Lorengau and Manus Island wrote that he could not speak too highly, quote, of the conduct of the police boys who obeyed my instructions not to fire without orders to the letter. Police Master Warrant Officer William Hill provides a second example. In March 1915, he reported to his district officer following an expedition to capture the murderers of a Labor recruiter, and said at one point his patrol had struggled to cross the river. Some of the boys, he said, succeeded in crossing, but, Hill admitted, I myself was swept away by the stream, and but for the timely help of two of the boys, should have been drowned. These two boys pluckily came to my assistance and dragged me ashore. It is rare to find accounts of such acknowledgement, rarer still where people are named as Johnson, the administrator, named Keogh. Commander Claude Cummeledge, 1914 Sepik River Expedition Report, was similarly praiseworthy of Sergeant Kundu. Mackenzie's official war history mentioned just two by name, an absolute chief named Lapapiri, who had been shot for resisting capture, and the so-called influential cannibal chief, Bowu, who had been shot and decapitated and his head displayed. Sergeant Keogh's action reminds us that the Australians completely depended on their New Guinea police. Completely. Putting New Guinea's own history to one side, which we so often do despite so much shared, these men are part of Australia's story of war. Thus, the work of history remains. Writers such as Adam Murray and Auguste Ibrahim Katuai have covered some of the adjacent territory, yet a single chapter in Charles Rowley's 1958 history is still the only direct discussion. Oral histories are being recorded, but they have yet to focus on the intergenerational family memories referencing the 1914-21 years. The Australian War Memorial also has work to do. Its online encyclopedia entry on Papua New Guineans completely silent on their 1914-21 service. To its credit, however, in 2018, the memorial hosted a research residency for Gunai Tua Tolai elder Gideon Kakabin, an historian, blogger and musician studying the Battle of Bitapaka. Tragically, Gideon died on the 20th of August 2018 before he had completed his report, though one of his surviving blogs indicates his feelings about the new fellow masters. Quote, when the Australians took over German New Guinea in 1914, the declaration which they read to the locals at Proclamation Square in Rabaul was a total sham and reflected entirely the Australian and British contempt for the New Guinea people. During the Second World War, Australian forces were supported by Papua New Guineans informally constituted army units, and informally as cooks, guides, labourers, medical assistants, and bearers transporting supplies and wounded Australians. Like Sergeant Kiep, they saved lives. And at the time, some were awarded an official medal by the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit. Then, between 2009 and 13, by which time most were dead, 100 or so Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels commemorative medallions were distributed. As anthropologist Victoria Stead and Memorial Summer Scholar Emma Rogerson showed, such recognition is deeply troubled. I took that photo in front of the Manuka RSL site after it was burnt down. Without the help of the Papuan carriers, Rogerson wrote, Australia would not have achieved what it did, nor indeed would have the ANMEF. Remember that force? In colonial settings, Stead argued, recognition reveals asymmetries of power, in effect confirming subordination. What then should we think when recognition is practically non-existent? Kiep, a rare exception. Even within the celebrated historical narrative of the so-called Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, much was concealed. So too with the ANMEF police. Ian Campbell, a New Zealand historian, called them paramilitary. You don't want to gild the lily here, but even so. And dangerous for the reasons they were useful. Charles Rowley called them an efficient bludgeon of the government. No one called any of them mate or cobber, but directly and indirectly they saved Australian soldiers' lives. Well, that's my three questions. To end, a couple of reflections, arising from looking afresh at this strange moment in our history, an episode doomed to neglect from the start. Three reflections. One, time-wise, it was so out of kilter. The ANMEF force cobbled together in haste, which landed on the 11th of September 1914, not the 25th of April 1915, and disbanded not in concert with the AIF, but later, on the 9th of May 1921. Two, it was the antithesis of that simplistic image, this capture and this occupation. The simplistic image, Anzacs, diggers, Western Front, light horse, carnage, relentless shelling, gas attacks. The complete opposite to that image of the War Memorial Roll of Honour, smothered in poppies, so popular with the media, publishers, and the tabloid logic, if it bleeds, it leads. And finally, it tested Army and Navy personnel in the tropics as colonial administrators with inadequate training and resources and subject to, given the terms of the surrender, German laws and minimal interest from their political masters, and disinclined to learn from Hubert Murray, the Lieutenant Governor of Papua. I could go on, but it's time to stop. Thank you sincerely for listening.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very thought-provoking. I'll now ask Michael questions if you have other chat, and then invite questions from the floor.
Brent, we've got time?
We've got time.
Okay.
Thank you. We've got plenty of time.
I'll ask a question to get us started, if that's all right.
Yes, please.
Michael, with all these sort of things, and when you resource information, particularly in archives, you get a leadership perspective.
Sorry,
and
Jason, we get what perspective?
Get a leadership perspective. You get a perspective.
Yeah, very good point.
Interested to know if the men themselves, who were being, who spent most of their time in contact with the Papua New Guineans, did call them cobber or mate.
Look, there's a standout exception, but mostly no. You won't be surprised to know they were of their time. Most of them. Look, can I interrupt myself? It's very hard to talk about the 3,000. The first 1,500 enlisted for 6 months. They go up there with Colonel Holmes. They do what they had to do, and most of them refused to stay on. They came back and they enlisted as soon as they could in the AIF, off to Europe. The next 1,500 in dribs and drabs go up to German New Guinea as replacements and reinforcements. This sounds a wandering answer, I'll get to your question. Increasingly, they were ex-AIF men coming back and for one reason or another re-enlisted for German New Guinea rather than go home. Most of them were not fit, couldn't cope with the tropics, drank too much, weren't physically fit anyway, got malaria, got sick, and had to be sent home. Now, that first cohort did keep good records at that low level, and they were not very respectful of their fellow man. If I can be elliptical a little bit, you got the message. There were one or two who took a shine to the locals, didn't slap them, didn't call them ugly, didn't wipe their hands before they touched food that they, as houseboys, delivered, were respectful to the women, but they're few and far between. One more thing, the sources are personal letters and diaries that I would have thought had been used by historians long ago in the same way historians of the First World War have used them for the European theatres. But there was also, for about 2.5 to 3 years, a monthly magazine called the Rabaul Record. And that truly captures the feelings of the men to their local environment. And thank God it's available online and digitized. I've started to waffle on, Jason.
That's all right.
I'd like to, the thing is now I'd like them to be, if not called mate or cobber, acknowledged more. Those statues, that George Silk photo, that iconic photo, the blind soldier, and that sculpture outside the Manda Carrara cell, they're Second World War men. But you could repeat those images of help in the First World War. So now let's call them something. I don't know. Our relationship with PNG is strong, continues to be strong, and if you're mad about rugby league, it's going to get even stronger. It's a little anyway. I'll stop, Jason. Sorry, I'm rabbiting on.
Is there another question?
Please.
Yes, Graham.
Michael, thanks very much. I'm amazed that the MEF wasn't disbanded until 1921.
Yes. Good. Yes.
You
Keep
read
going. Keep going.
you sort of think, oh, well, it was all over in 1915.
I know.
That's an amazing fact, and I really appreciate you sharing that. Just
You
one
are. Yeah.
other
Sorry.
sort of question, a bit probably off track. You mentioned right at the start that some of the Germans were sent back to Australia for internment.
Yes.
Do you know where they were interred?
Mostly Liverpool.
Okay. Yep.
And I tried to pursue. If I ever there, the infuriating thing is, I'm sure everyone here tonight would know. You get your teeth into something, you present the paper or get the, whatever, and then you think, shit, if I live for another life, I've got all these other things to pursue, and that's one of them. There were, and one or two died in Liverpool. And when I have two whole chapters on trying to pin down the accurate casualty figures. And I think there's a case to record some of those Germans who died in Liverpool technically should be recorded somewhere in relation to Australians in German New Guinea. Can I say one more thing about your first comment? Most people are shocked because it's lasted so long, because the focus was always just on the front end, just on the 6 months, just on the capture, just on and no one's interested in occupation. And if there's no active danger, you also lose out on honours and awards. Occupations sit in this no man's land. The Australians were babysitting that territory until Versailles decided who'd won and who was going to get what. But it is correct. It's little known. Most people think the first big reinforcement after Holmes and his 1500 had come home, called Tropical Force, was not part of the ANMEF, but it was. It was just a shorthand for the 3rd Battalion. The 1st Battalion went with the first 15. Sorry, I'm raving on again. The 1st Battalion went with the first 1500. The other 500 were naval reserves. The 2nd Battalion was the so-called Kanana 500, or the Dirty 500, the Queensland enlistees who were meant to go to Rabaul and were rejected. The 3rd Battalion was Petherbridge's Tropical Force. And the 4th Battalion were in dribs and drabs, 100 here, 50 there, through to May 21. And sorry, one more. The fact that there were men in uniform and dying that late through to May 21 means that it messed with the War Memorial's roll of honour, because you know what the First World War cut-off date to qualify a war-related death at the War Memorial? It's the disbandment of the AIF on the 31st of March 1921, 5 weeks earlier than the ANMEF, who was still in uniform, technically, and still dying of malaria. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Jan, you had a question?
Thank you.
Is that me?
Yes.
Jan, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, that's fascinating.
Thank you.
I know about, obviously, the Rabaul, the taking of the wireless station, etc.
Yes.
My question is, there are two questions, actually. One was the title of your book, which is a bit of a mix of pidgin and English. Is that intentional?
Sorry?
Is that intentional, the title of your book?
Yes, it is. It is. It's partly to allude to my feeling that the the New Guinea police should be acknowledged. But it's also because the proclamation that Holmes issued 5 days after the capture was issued in German and Pidgin. And you're quite right. A number of commentators have said it's not really toxin. It's not technically proper, the proclamation in local language, but final answer, sorry. 5 or 6 times in this one-page proclamation, the Australians keep saying, "We're here now, we're new fellow master." And they end the proclamation saying, "No more Kaiser, God save him King." They're basically saying, German defeated, we big fellow now, we're here now. The Australians absolutely needed the labourers on the plantations to go back because they'd all done a runner.
Yeah.
And they needed the German native police to be re-signed with a new uniform and a new master. So it's quite a loaded title. Yes.
Right. That's very interesting. It leads me to my second question, which was, how much evidence did you find about what happened after the war? There was a huge land grab.
There was.
And people coming up. I believe that John Howard's father and uncle were sent to squat there on a plantation. When did that start? That's your next book.
There is a certain amount. You're absolutely right about. I'm so chuffed you said that. David Marr has written about John Howard's father. They were dummying.
Yes,
they were fronts for big plantation money. I kept trying not to drift into the 20s, but the flavour of the territory administration for the next 20 years through to the Second World War was military. And you only need to look at the history of Papua and the mandated territory of New Guinea to see such contrast. And there was a lot of ex-servicemen tried to make money. Almost all of them. There wasn't a soldier settler scheme as such, but most of them tried. Some of them couldn't get the tropics out of their system, and tried to make a go of it running plantations. I mean, blokes who'd run an orchard up in northeast Victoria thought, I can grow copra. I mean, it's a different challenge, I tell you. Most of them couldn't believe how hot it was and how humid. They were just so out of their comfort zone. The officers, the day they got there, would find out where Chinatown and the tailor was and have a white suit run up for them. They were ill-kitted. They were out of their depths. They were doing their best. They were thrown in the deep end. They had the same attitude to the locals as they had to Indigenous Australians, which is pretty right. People of the times. Sorry, I'm raving on again.
No, it's true.
David Marr wrote about John Howard's father. It's a brilliant little piece. I'm sure you could Google it. Dummying. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for coming along.
Congratulations again.
We'll see how it goes.
Any more questions? Peter Edwards.
Sorry, I'll switch the microphone
on. Peter.
It does help. Michael, lovely to see you.
How are you?
Lovely to hear you, Michael. And thank you for a fascinating talk. And as you say, it's stuff that should have been experienced, should have been covered long ago. And I'm just wondering about further explanation, which you've already covered in a sense, why it has been neglected for so long. I do remember back in the 1970s when there was that great debate about Australia the defence of Australia vis-a-vis expeditionary forces and so on.
Yes.
And Arthur Tang used to pointedly comment that Australia's first involvement in the First World War was off to Rabaul and PNG rather than across to Gallipoli or anywhere else on the other side of the world. But that doesn't seem to have inspired anyone to go more deeply into not just the ANMEF, but what followed. Have you come across other attempts to tread there or to go into that area?
I haven't, but you've touched on I mean, look, the one sentence answer is it was so overshadowed by Gallipoli and the Western Front and the scale of carnage, etc. And I mean, within a year, as we know, Anzac had become a name, not a sort of initials for a corps. But Tang's comment places him in a very small and exclusive group who remembered that New Guinea was all about, this is Hughes's attempt to cash in the 60,000 dead to get something as a buffer. I mean, it turned out not to work, but this need for a buffer, and remember, the German colonies, Pacific colonies above the equator, the Carolines, the Marshalls, etc. Japan swiftly occupied them, did a deal with Britain, ended up with their own C-class mandate. The one thing they couldn't do was they had to, we know the League of Nations conditions were that you had to disarm. So even at Rabaul, artillery pieces were unpacked, as it were. But there was a strategic agenda, and it's often overlooked now, as is the whole part of our military history. I'd like it to be remembered again, not least because, I mean, you look at this, sorry, I'm raving on and we've gone past 8 o'clock. The speeches by ministers, by governors general, etc., in September last year for the 50th anniversary, they all refer back to the Second World War and our shared history. I keep shouting at the screen saying, but it started, Tang was right. I hate to say that. But anyway, it's a waffly answer, but to repeat the very first point, Anzac overshadowed the earlier landing. And it's never managed to find the front row. Even though there was an entire, as by SS Mackenzie in 1927, an entire volume of the official history. I better stop, Peter, but it's so lovely to see you.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Not at all. You're the patron of a very fine organisation.
Indeed.
Brent's smiling now.
Oh, I'm happy. It's been a great presentation. Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Now, unless if there's not another question, we'll move on to other business. You're welcome to stay and listen, Michael, but it's what's coming up.
I might go and have a glass of red.
Well done. Well
okay.
Earned.
And thank you again to you and Jason and the audience.
If I may say, Michael, thank you. And on our website, our old 2014, we did a conference on the first fateful shot, and
yes,
there's in there by Monday.
It's in my bibliography, and I refer to it.
Brilliant.
Yeah. It was a very fine day, according to the transcripts and so on. Yeah, you were ahead of your time. See you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's a little bit of extra news. We have a conference coming up. We talked about that last meeting. I won't read it out again. But the most important thing about it is that it has been moved to Brook House, 44 Victoria Avenue, Albert Park, because of the fire at Waverley RSL has made it unoccupiable. So the rest of the information there, and there'll be plenty of times when this comes out again. Vietnam 3050, 30 years of the war, 50 years of reflection. It'll be our 2-day conference of the year. And next presenter will be on it Wednesday, the 10th of June. Peter Mitchell, who will speak about his new book, I'll Walk Beside You, Love, Loss, and the Bermuda Railway and Human Spirit. Vivid portrait of the most desperate chapter in our nation's history. I'll Walk Beside You has been written from never seen before letters, diaries, and oral histories, and weaves the story of soldiers against a parallel story of love between the real-life couple Jean and Cal. Told through the perspective of ordinary men drawn into the heart of war, I'll Walk Beside You is an ode to heroism, the unyielding human spirit, and the enduring resilience that shaped the Australian military history. And this brings the evening session to a close. Thanks to Michael, thanks to Jason, who keeps things going behind the scenes, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Hope you come again soon. Good night to you all.
Thank you.
From the committee and myself.